He never noticed the black sedan parked across the street. He never noticed the woman inside, her hands trembling against the steering wheel as she watched him unlock a rusted bicycle from the company rack. And he never noticed that the most powerful woman in the building, the CEO, whose name was etched in glass above the lobby, had just decided to follow him home. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet strength of people who never give up, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us why compassion still matters. Daniel Harper had worked as a janitor at Aldridge Technologies for nearly 6 years. Most employees barely knew his name. To them, he was simply the quiet man pushing a mop bucket down polished hallways after sunset, the one who fixed flickering lights and emptied trash bins with careful hands. He always kept his head down. He always worked late. And he always left alone. To Isabella Grant, the CEO of Aldridge, Daniel was invisible until the night she saw something that unsettled her. She had stayed late to review quarterly losses. The company was struggling after a failed product launch, investors were nervous, and the board was breathing down her neck. As she walked toward the elevator, heels echoing in the empty lobby, she noticed Daniel in the corner of the glass-walled conference room. He wasn't cleaning. He was sitting at the long mahogany table, surrounded by stacks of discarded paperwork. He was studying. At first, she felt irritation. Company policy prohibited hourly staff from lingering in executive spaces after their shift. But then she looked closer. He wasn't idly flipping through pages. He was highlighting sections, writing notes in the margins of documents that had been thrown away. Market analyses, strategy proposals, budget drafts. His face was focused, almost desperate. Isabella didn't confront him that night. Instead, she watched from the shadows. There was something haunting about the way he studied those papers as if his future depended on it. The next day, curiosity gnawed at her. Human Resources confirmed he had no college degree, just a high school diploma and a spotless work record. No complaints, no absences, no disciplinary notes. Oh, that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. 2 weeks later, she saw him again, this time at 10:30 p.m., wiping down whiteboards after a tense executive meeting. Everyone had left frustrated. Sales were declining. Morale was low. Yet Daniel paused in front of the whiteboard covered in half-erased projections. He studied the numbers carefully before pulling a small notebook from his pocket and writing something down. That was the moment Isabella decided to follow him. The black sedan kept a careful distance as Daniel pedaled through dimly lit streets. He rode for nearly 40 minutes, weaving past shuttered stores and abandoned lots. Eventually, he stopped in front of a small, aging apartment complex with peeling paint and a broken neon sign. Isabella parked across the street. Daniel carried his bike up the stairs instead of locking it outside. The hallway lights flickered. The building looked fragile, tired, like it had given up on being seen. A few minutes later, Isabella saw a small figure rush into Daniel's arms when he opened the apartment door. A little girl no older than 7 wrapped her arms around his waist. Even from a distance, Isabella could see the way Daniel's exhaustion melted into warmth. He wasn't just a janitor. He was a father. Over the next several evenings, Isabella found herself returning to that street. She told herself it was simple curiosity, but deep down, she knew it was something else. She watched Daniel carry grocery bags upstairs. She saw him repair a loose stair railing for an elderly neighbor. She noticed how he would sit by the window late at night, papers spread out before him again. One evening, something changed. Rain poured relentlessly, soaking the streets. Isabella had almost decided not to come. But as she parked, she saw flashing ambulance lights reflecting off wet pavement. Her heart dropped. Paramedics carried the elderly neighbor from the building. Daniel stood in the rain, holding his daughter tightly, speaking urgently to a police officer. Isabella stepped out of her car without thinking. She stayed at a distance, but listened carefully. The elderly woman had collapsed from dehydration. She had no immediate family nearby. Daniel had been checking on her daily. Later, when the ambulance left, Daniel didn't go inside. He remained outside in the rain, staring at the building with a look that wasn't fear, but worry. The kind of worry that runs deeper than finances, the kind that comes from carrying too much responsibility alone. The following week at the office, Isabella couldn't shake what she had seen. During an executive meeting, her team argued over cost-cutting measures. Layoffs were proposed. Maintenance and custodial departments were listed among non-essential operations to outsource Daniel's department. Isabella felt a sharp twist in her chest. That evening, she did something unprecedented. She asked security to quietly pull footage from after-hours cameras over the past year. She watched hours of silent recordings, Daniel cleaning meticulously, Daniel fixing things beyond his job description, Daniel staying late to reorganize storage rooms without being asked. And then she saw something that stopped her breath. One night, months ago, the fire alarm system had malfunctioned. A small electrical fire sparked in a storage closet. The footage showed Daniel noticing smoke before sensors activated. He rushed inside, extinguished the flames with a nearby extinguisher, and prevented what could have become a devastating fire. No report had ever reached her desk. No one had credited him. He had simply cleaned up the mess and continued working. Isabella leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by a wave of shame. She had spent years speaking about corporate responsibility and community values, yet she had never truly looked at the people who held her company together from the ground up. The next day, she did something radical. She invited Daniel to a private meeting. He entered her office cautiously, his uniform pressed neatly, his posture respectful but guarded. His eyes carried the weight of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Isabella studied him differently now. Not as an employee number, but as a man who rode 40 minutes home to a fragile building. As a father who studied discarded strategies at night. As someone who had saved her company from disaster without recognition. She asked him about his life. He spoke plainly, carefully. He had once attended community college, studying business administration, but dropped out when his wife became ill. Medical bills consumed their savings. She passed away 2 years later. Since then, he had been raising their daughter alone. He never asked for sympathy. He never blamed anyone. He simply stated facts. When Isabella asked about the notes he took from meeting papers, he hesitated before admitting he studied business in hopes of someday applying for an entry-level analyst position. He knew it was unlikely. But he believed understanding the company made him better at his current job. There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet determination. That night, Isabella drove past his apartment again, but this time she didn't stay in the car. She walked up the stairs and knocked. Daniel opened the door, surprised but composed. His daughter peeked from behind him, clutching a worn teddy bear. Inside, the apartment was small but spotless. Books stacked neatly, crayons arranged carefully. On one wall hung a framed photo of a smiling woman. Isabella saw everything clearly now. The resilience, the dignity, the invisible heroism. Over the next month, changes began subtle at first. Isabella halted the outsourcing proposal. Instead, she launched an internal development program for hourly staff, offering scholarships for continuing education. She quietly arranged for Daniel to receive a full company-sponsored degree program in business analytics, structured around his work schedule. She didn't stop there. She ordered a comprehensive review of safety protocols, ensuring employees at every level were recognized for risk prevention and innovation. Daniel's act of stopping the fire was formally acknowledged at a company-wide meeting. For the first time, he stood under bright lights not as a janitor, but as someone who had protected everyone. His daughter watched from the front row, clapping harder than anyone. Months passed. Daniel balanced work, school, and fatherhood with relentless effort. There were nights he nearly gave up. There were exams taken after sleepless shifts, but each time exhaustion threatened him, he remembered his daughter's eyes shining in that auditorium. Isabella watched his transformation with a quiet pride she hadn't felt in years. The company slowly improved too. Morale shifted. Employees felt seen. Productivity increased, not because of stricter rules, but because leadership had changed its heart. One evening, as Daniel prepared to leave work, Isabella stopped him in the lobby. Inside was a formal offer for a junior analyst position, effective immediately upon completion of his certification, which he had just earned with top marks. Daniel's hands trembled as he read. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was earned. 2 years later, Daniel no longer rode a rusted bicycle home. He drove a modest car, one he had saved carefully for. His daughter attended a better school. They moved into a brighter apartment where the lights didn't flicker. But he never forgot where he started, and Isabella never forgot the night she chose to look beyond a uniform. If this story has touched your heart so far, please take a moment to like, share, and comment. Your engagement helps these stories of hope reach people who may be struggling silently, just like Daniel once was, because sometimes the most powerful transformations don't begin in boardrooms. They begin in parking lots, in rain-soaked streets, in quiet acts of courage no one applauds. Before we close, I have a special request. Comment the word "I'll respect" if you believe every hardworking parent deserves to be seen and valued. Years later, Alderidge Technologies became known not just for innovation but for opportunity. Internal promotions doubled. Employee retention soared. The culture shifted from hierarchy to humanity. And at the center of that transformation was a choice. A CEO chose to follow a janitor. A leader chose to see a father. A company chose to recognize invisible strength. Daniel eventually stood in the same executive conference room where he once studied discarded papers. This time, he presented his own strategy proposal, one that helped the company enter new markets successfully. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. But the moment that mattered most happened later that night when he returned home. His daughter, now taller and more confident, hugged him at the door just like she had years before. Only this time, his exhaustion had been replaced with fulfillment. Isabella often reflected on how close she had come to making a different decision, to cutting costs, to outsourcing departments, to never knowing the quiet brilliance hidden behind a mop bucket. Leadership, she realized, wasn't about titles. It was about attention, about noticing who stays late, about asking why someone studies discarded papers, about believing that potential can exist anywhere. And sometimes it's about parking across the street on a rainy night and choosing to look closer. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of kindness and second chances. Your support keeps these messages alive, because somewhere out there, another Daniel is working late, and somewhere else, another Isabella is one choice away from changing everything. The applause in the conference room that afternoon had been loud, respectful, earned, but it wasn't the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything came 3 weeks later when the board of directors called an emergency meeting. Daniel had barely settled into his new role as junior analyst when the tension began building again. The company's expansion strategy, his strategy, had shown promising early results. New partnerships were forming. Revenue curves were beginning to tilt upward. Employees were energized in ways they hadn't been in years. But growth attracts attention. Alderidge Technologies had become the target of a hostile takeover attempt from a larger competitor that had quietly been buying shares. The board was nervous. Investors were divided. Rumors spread through the hallways like wildfire. Layoffs were whispered about again. Uncertainty returned like a storm cloud over a city that had just begun to rebuild. Daniel felt it immediately. The energy in the office shifted from hopeful to anxious. Conversations lowered to murmurs. Meetings ran longer. Security tightened. And for Daniel, the fear was personal. He knew what instability meant. He knew what it felt like to watch security crumble beneath your feet. He had lived that reality when hospital bills swallowed his savings and grief swallowed his world. He had promised himself and his daughter that he would never again allow their future to rest on fragile ground. One evening, long after most employees had left, Daniel remained seated in the conference room where he used to study discarded papers. Only this time, the table wasn't scattered with trash-bound drafts. It was covered in financial statements, shareholder reports, and projections related to the takeover attempt. He wasn't cleaning anymore. He was fighting. Isabella stood outside the glass wall, watching him the same way she once had years ago. The difference now was that he belonged there. His suit wasn't expensive, but it fit him with quiet confidence. His posture was no longer guarded. It was focused. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The takeover bid was aggressive. The competitor's plan was clear: acquire Aldridge, strip non-profitable divisions, consolidate operations, and eliminate redundant roles. Daniel didn't need to ask what that meant. Custodial staff, maintenance, support teams, the very people who had once been labeled a non-essential. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Isabella laid out the board's dilemma. Some members believed selling would secure investor profit and shield them from long-term risk. Others believed independence was worth the fight, but they needed a defensive strategy fast. Daniel listened carefully. He went home that night restless. His daughter, now 9, sat at the kitchen table finishing homework under brighter lights than the old apartment had ever offered. Their new home was modest but stable, safe, earned. He watched her from the doorway and felt the weight of everything at stake, not just for himself, but for hundreds of families like his once was. That night, he opened his laptop after she fell asleep. He studied shareholder structures. He analyzed voting thresholds. He dug into bylaws most executives barely glanced at. His mind worked the way it always had: methodical, relentless, determined. By sunrise, an idea had formed. Over the next week, Daniel presented a counter-strategy to Isabella and a select group of executives. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't built on ego. It was built on people. He proposed launching an employee stock ownership initiative, offering long-term staff the opportunity to purchase discounted shares through payroll contributions matched partially by the company. It would strengthen internal ownership, shift voting power, and make a hostile acquisition significantly harder. But more than that, it would send a message. Aldridge belonged to its people. The board was skeptical at first. It required courage. It required trust. It required short-term sacrifice for long-term protection. Daniel stood at the head of the same table he once wiped clean every night and spoke with a quiet conviction that silenced doubt. He didn't argue numbers alone. He spoke about culture, about loyalty, about what happens when employees are treated not as expendable costs but as stakeholders. He spoke as someone who had once been invisible. The vote was close, but the motion passed. The announcement rippled through the company like electricity. Employees who had never imagined owning even a fraction of corporate stock suddenly found themselves invited into something bigger. Meetings were held. Financial literacy workshops were organized. Participation exceeded expectations. Within months, the takeover attempt weakened. Share distribution shifted. The competitor retreated. Aldridge remained independent. And this time, it wasn't saved by a fire extinguisher in a storage closet. It was saved by a janitor who had studied discarded papers and refused to stop believing he belonged in the room. The transformation didn't end there. The employee ownership program ignited something deeper. Departments collaborated more openly. Innovation accelerated. Turnover dropped dramatically. Custodial and maintenance staff, once at risk of outsourcing, became some of the most loyal shareholders. Daniel often walked past the cleaning carts in the evenings, long after his official hours, remembering the nights he pushed one himself. He made it a habit to stop, to ask names, to listen to stories. He never forgot. One afternoon, Isabella invited him to her office again. The same office where he had once stood nervously in his pressed uniform. This time, she wasn't offering a scholarship. She was offering a promotion. Senior Strategy Manager. Daniel felt the old tremble in his hands, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was gratitude mixed with awe, not because of the title, but because of the journey. He accepted. At the company-wide meeting announcing his promotion, there was no flashy corporate video, no dramatic music. Just Isabella standing at the podium, telling the story of how leadership sometimes grows in the least expected places. Daniel's daughter sat in the front row again, older now, understanding more than she had before. She watched her father stand taller than she had ever seen him. But the most powerful moment happened quietly after the applause faded. An elderly woman approached him near the exit. It was the neighbor he had once checked on in that crumbling apartment building. She had recovered. Her health had improved. And when she heard his name mentioned on the news during coverage of the takeover battle, she had recognized it instantly. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged him. For a moment, Daniel was back in the rain, holding his daughter outside that flickering building. Only now, he stood surrounded by light. Years passed. Aldridge became a case study in business schools for its employee-driven turnaround. Other companies adopted similar ownership models. Isabella was invited to leadership conferences where she spoke not about quarterly profits, but about paying attention, about walking past job titles and seeing human potential. Daniel eventually became vice president of strategic development. Yet he still arrived early some mornings, walking through quiet hallways before the rush began. He would pause near the storage closet where the small electrical fire had once sparked and run his hand gently along the wall. It reminded him how close his life had come to staying small. At home, his daughter grew into a confident young woman who talked about studying engineering. She often teased him about the rusted bicycle he still kept in the garage, even though he could afford something far better now. He kept it as a reminder, because success, he learned, is not measured by how far you rise, but by how many people you lift with you. One evening, years after the takeover battle, Daniel and Isabella stood together at the company's annual celebration event. Employees filled the auditorium. Laughter echoed. There was a warmth in the air that money alone could never buy. Isabella leaned toward him and quietly admitted something she had never said out loud before. She told him that the night she followed him home, she hadn't just discovered who he was. She had rediscovered who she wanted to be. Daniel looked out at the crowd, custodians, engineers, receptionists, analysts, executives, all standing on equal footing as shareholders in the same dream. And he realized something profound. The most powerful leadership decision Isabella ever made wasn't launching a product. It wasn't negotiating a deal. It was choosing to see him. If this continuation of Daniel's journey touched your heart, take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how ordinary people can create extraordinary change. And before we close, comment the word "seen" if you believe every hardworking person deserves to be recognized for their worth. Because somewhere tonight, someone is pushing a mop down a quiet hallway. Someone is studying discarded papers after everyone else goes home. Someone is carrying dreams that don't match their job title, and somewhere else, someone with power has a choice to overlook them or to look closer. Daniel Harper's life changed because one leader chose the second option, and in doing so, she didn't just change his future. She changed her own. She changed a company. She proved that greatness is not found in glass offices or corner suites. It is found in courage, in compassion, in paying attention when no one else does. And sometimes it begins with a black sedan parked quietly across the street and a decision that changes everything.